working with translations and what it means to have different translations of the Bible. One of the topics of this class is how did we get the Bible, and then what do we do with the Bible? So I have some notes up here that you can follow along, and hopefully it'll be a little easier for you. I can also give you a copy of these notes if you like. So working with translations. Well, maybe you wonder why do we have different translations of the Bible? In English, there are so many translations of the Bible. It seems like every year there's a new translation. One of the websites that I like to go to quite often is called Bible Gateway. And let me share with you Bible Gateway. So I go here to look up things quite often, Bible verses. It's just an easy website. And so if I was going to look up, let's just say John 3:16, I can just put that in here, and it gives me John 3:16 in the English Standard Version. Now at the bottom of the page it says John 3:16 in all English translations. So if I click on that, there's a lot of different translations listed here, and this is only English. So that's a lot, and you can compare the different wording of these translations. Now, in a verse like this, there's probably not too much different. Sometimes it's just a matter of a few words, but sometimes the differences can be quite big, and sometimes translators will even they'll choose different words. Now let's check if there are other translations. I think there might be some Chinese translations. I'm not sure what the Chinook, I'm not sure what that one is, but or Tagalog versions. So all the different languages they have here. And so some languages will have multiple translations. For example, Russian, they have quite a few here. Some will only have one version. There's quite a few in Tagalog, quite a list of Tagalog Bibles. But anyway, so the question is, why do we have so many different translations, and what do they mean? Translation is an important part of interpreting the Bible. What is translation of the Bible? Basically, we're taking God's message found in the pages of the Bible that in its original languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, and we put it into our own language. Now, very few people actually know the biblical languages. They just, it takes a lot of work to learn Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek. It takes a couple of years of studying every day. But there are some ways that you can learn to use these languages without having to go memorize all the different grammar and vocabulary and so on. I'll show you a couple ways today that will make it easier for you. So the languages of the Bible, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, they're all what we call dead languages. In other words, they're not spoken in the same form that they were 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. Now, there's still a few groups in the world who speak these. Hebrew has been revived and is become one of the important languages in Israel, but modern Hebrew is different than biblical Hebrew. Aramaic, well, there's very few people who speak this, only maybe a couple of small villages. And modern Greek, which is spoken in Greece, is a lot different than Koine Greek. Even if a person knows these languages, it's still very challenging to interpret the Old Testament. So we all have to deal with translations unless you know these biblical languages. Biblical Hebrew, Aramaic, and Koine Greek are what are the languages that the Bible was written in. Few people can read the original biblical languages, so most people rely on translations into modern languages. But this is going to be very challenging for us because every translation involves some degree of interpretation. Anytime you go from one language to another, you lose something. And you know this because you both have different languages than English. And so it's very challenging to go from English to your language or to go from your language into English. The same is true when it comes to the languages of the Bible. Yeah. That's why there are different translations today. Everyone may have just a little different interpretation of the original biblical languages. It's helpful to consider the nature of language. So, number one, translation always involves interpretation. Anytime you go from one language to another, choices must be made about what words to use to represent the words in the original language. Well, here's a very simple word that we just kind of bring into our languages today. Hallelujah. Well, that's a Hebrew word, hallelujah. And so, you know, most of the time we know that it means praise the Lord. That would be a literal translation. But there's a lot of other words that can have multiple meanings depending how they are used. And so a translator has to choose which words from one language mean what the word is in another language. For example, the Hebrew word chesed, that is a word that can mean love, covenant, covenantal faithfulness, sometimes even mercy. Lots of different translations for that one Hebrew word. And so we always have to look at the context. Number two, no two languages have the same vocabulary and grammar. Something is always lost in translation. And so translators attempt to minimize this loss. Often, many words are required to translate one word from the original language. There are some words in Greek that is just one word, but in English, you end up using almost an entire sentence to translate one word. And so that's what translators do. You cannot always go just word for word. Sometimes you can, but many times you have to have many words in the translation to represent one or two words in the original language. Number three, words have different meanings depending on their usage and context. This meaning can change over time. The whole range of meaning is called the semantic domain. So it's kind of like a circle. So within that circle for the word, there are many possibilities. So whatever the possibilities are what's called the semantic domain. An author will choose a word's nuance from within that circle to get across the meaning that he or she wants to have. It's difficult for us and almost impossible many times to choose exactly which word within that circle is the meaning that the author intended. And so you might have a Bible commentary that is doing a word study, and they may come up with 3 or 4 possible translations of a particular word from the Bible. Number 4, the best way to know the possible translations of a word is to study the biblical languages. So you take time, you study the Hebrew and Greek. Aramaic's pretty minor, so most people don't spend time on that. But Hebrew and Greek, you take the time. I've studied Hebrew and Greek for many years. I'm much better at Hebrew because I work with that every day when I do my devotions. Hebrew's kind of rusty, but it takes a lot of effort and a lot of time. But if you cannot study the Greek and Hebrew, the next best thing is to use several modern translations and compare them. So like what I do sometimes is I compare English translations, like I had in that list from Bible Gateway. There must be 50 different translations. So you can choose several of those and compare. That's not always the case with other languages because they may not have so many translations. But you can compare English and another language. So that gets down into the deeper Bible study. I want to take a few minutes then to teach you a little bit about the biblical languages. Let's start with Hebrew. A little background on biblical Hebrew. Hebrew was a Northwest Semitic language, along with other languages, Phoenician, Ugaritic, Aramaic, and Amorite. These all are part of a family of languages, kind of like dialects. They're very similar, a lot of the same vocabulary. The words would be somewhat similar. Hebrew was spoken and written primarily in the area of Canaan, which is where Israel settled. More than 99% of the Old Testament was first written in Hebrew. The most common modern version of the Hebrew Bible is produced by the German Bible Society called the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, and it's abbreviated just simply as BHS. This is the standard Hebrew text that modern translators use and Bible scholars as well. It is based on the Leningrad Codex. A codex is a copy manuscript, an ancient manuscript of the actual handwriting. So the Leningrad Codex is stored in Leningrad. That's where its name comes from. But it is the oldest complete Old Testament that we have in Hebrew. And it was written about the year 1008. So it's a very important manuscript. And so if you'd like to see what it looks like, I can show you. Let me bring up another, I'll share a different program with you, my Logos software. So BHS right here. So I don't know if you can see that very well. So that's from Psalm 110, verse 1. So that's what's called the Masoretic text from BHS. So if we go up to the very beginning of this. See if we go all the way up. So this is Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. And so it comes from the Deutsche Bibelgesellschaft Stuttgart, which means the Bible Society, the German Bible Society of Stuttgart. So this is the opening of Genesis. Well, I don't know about you, but that looks very difficult to read. It would take you probably a couple of days, a couple of weeks of study to be able to know how to read these letters. Okay, so let's go back to the notes. All right, so that's called the Masoretic text because the Masoretes were a group of Jews who put in the little dots and dashes. The original Hebrew only had consonants. So I'll show you about that a little bit here in a minute. There have been 4 major periods of Hebrew. Biblical Hebrew, which is what we have in the Bible, was spoken from 1300 to 200 BC. And then the next major period is called Mishnaic or Rabbinic Hebrew from 200 BC to AD 600. Then there's medieval Hebrew from roughly 800 to 1800. And then modern Hebrew, which has been spoken mostly since Israel became a nation again. So the script of Hebrew, what we would call the actual alphabet, the letters, the earliest Hebrew was written in what's called Paleo-Hebrew script, and it's a little bit curved. It's kind of hard to see or to understand. And this is what the Dead Sea Scrolls were written in. And then around just before Jesus, a square script was adopted from Aramaic. And that's what we have in our Bibles. The Hebrew Bible is written in square script, and I will show you the alphabet in a few minutes. And then, as I said, the little vowel points were added by the Masoretes around the year AD 500. So let me just put in here real quick. I'll just copy and paste a couple of letters from the very beginning of Genesis so you can see. Okay, so let me make that a little bigger. Okay, so you can see this a little better. So you see the little dots and the little, they look like small T's and the little dot at the top. Those are called vowel points. Those were added by the Masoretes around the year 500 AD. And they put those in to preserve the pronunciation. But the original Hebrew did not have the vowel points like I'm erasing here. Oh, it's a little hard to erase. Whoops. Oops, one more. So you can see, basically, I'm trying to get rid of those vowel points. So most of them are erased now. Okay, so the original Hebrew looked like this. Okay. And so it's very hard to know. Those are all consonants, and it's hard to know how to pronounce that. So the Masoretes added the little dots and dashes for the pronunciation. And so this actually says Bereshit bara. So in the beginning, and then I only have the word created here, but we know Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so that's what these words are. In the beginning, God created. Well, God's the next word. Okay. Well, some characteristics of Hebrew. Shannon, can you go turn the aircon on, please?
Of course.
Hebrew is based on roots, usually of 3 consonants, like this word right here, 3 consonants. This word has 3 consonants right there. Most Hebrew words have 3 letters to them, 3 consonants. Vowel points and suffixes and prefixes are added to the roots to give different meanings. And so these are all suffixes and prefixes. So these are added to the roots of the consonants. And these tell you, like this, the letter bait at the beginning is another word for in. So in the beginning, created. So compared to Indo-European languages like English, Hebrew lacks adjectives and adverbs. It's kind of like a flat language. It's not very descriptive. This means Hebrew is well suited for action-based narratives and word picture poetry. It is less equipped to work with abstract ideas and theological distinctions. The normal word order is verb, subject, object. So here we have the verb towards the beginning of the sentence. The verbs usually come first, which gives us a clue. If the verb is first, that means it's important. So when you study the Old Testament, always look at the verbs, the action words, because those are important. They were important to Hebrew people. And so they're important in our Bible study. So the verb is central and primary. It has no time. There are 2 basic tenses which denote kind of action. Perfect, meaning that it's completed, so the action is past. And imperfect means it's not completed, so it's in the future. So Hebrew is kind of like a primitive language. It's which means that there's a lot of openness to interpretation. Let's go on to another language of the Bible, Aramaic. Aramaic was also a Northwest Semitic language. It's very similar to Hebrew. In past centuries, often scholars did not recognize that it existed in the Bible because it looks the same. But as people studied more, they realized that the words are different and the grammar is different. After the Assyrians gained power in the 8th century, Aramaic became the official language of diplomacy and commerce. It became the main language in the Middle East until Greek took over, when Alexander the Great conquered that part of the world. And then Greek became the international language. Jesus spoke Aramaic because it was the common language of Galilee during his time. Aramaic portions of the Old Testament consist. Okay, internet keeps going in and out. Okay, the Aramaic in the Old Testament is only 2 words in Genesis, and then 1 verse in Jeremiah, a portion of Ezra, and then part of the book of Daniel. So those are the parts in Aramaic. In the New Testament, there are uh, 5 words in the New Testament: Cephas, Tabitha, Maranatha, Ephphatha, Talitha, Kumi. So not very many Aramaic words in the New Testament, mostly just quotations. This was the language that Jesus and the disciples spoke, was Aramaic. So that means our Greek New Testament is a translation of what Jesus said. We do not have the actual words of Jesus. We have a translation from Aramaic, which he was speaking, to Greek. So that creates some very big challenges that Bible scholars have talked about and argued over quite a bit. So Greek is an Indo-European language. That means it's related to English and Latin and German and Spanish and so on. So learning Greek is a lot easier for an English speaker than learning Hebrew. When I was learning Hebrew, it always gave me a headache because it was just so different. It was very challenging. It's kind of like me trying to learn Tagalog. Very, very, very difficult. But Greek and English are fairly close. In fact, there are a lot of words in Greek that come directly over to English. You probably know, if you know English, you probably know at least 300 or 400 Greek words in the New Testament. You don't even need to study them. You just know them because the English and the Greek are just about the same. So a history of the Greek language. The earliest Greek, spoken from 2000 to 900 BC, was spoken by 3 groups: the Ionians, the Aeolians, and the Dorians. And scholars believe that the Philistines came from these groups. Classical Greek was spoken from 900 to 330 BC. And it's represented in the earliest Greek literature, such as Homer. This is what a lot of the Greek philosophers wrote in, like Plato and Aristotle and some of those classics. And its influence ended with the conquest of Alexander the Great. So Alexander introduced kind of a common Greek known as Koine Greek. And this Greek existed for about 600 years. And so wherever Alexander conquered, he brought his language. And so that means that Greek became the international language by the 1st century. And so people like Paul, many of the apostles spoke Greek. They also knew Aramaic. Paul knew Aramaic as well, but he wrote his letters in Greek. So all of the New Testament was written in Koine Greek. And then also the Old Testament translation from Hebrew into Greek, known as the Septuagint, that was written also in Koine Greek. Okay, Byzantine Greek. That's the next major era of Greek, and that was during the Byzantine Empire. And then we have modern Greek, which today is spoken with about 15 million people in the area of Greece and Cyprus. Not very many people speak modern Greek. So some characteristics of Greek. It's very inflectional. That means words are changed a lot. So prefixes, changes inside a word called infix, and then suffix at the end of words. All of these changes within a word tell us what kind of word it is and where it fits in the sentence. Greek is very precise, and it tells you exactly if your word is a subject, a verb, an object, an indirect object, and so on. So it's very nice for translation and interpretation. You can be fairly precise in your analysis of the Greek language. So that's the brief overview of the Bible languages. Let's pause for a moment, and I want to uh, sh show you what these languages actually look like. And you can practice if you want. And so if you want to actually speak these letters out loud, you can do that if you want. You can find this information on the internet. Just put in biblical Hebrew or learn Greek. There's so many nice programs out today. I'll show you also some tools in a few minutes. So this is the Greek alphabet on the left. And the first one is first column is the actual letters in the Greek. I'll make it a little bigger so you can see. And then the next column over, this is what's called transliteration. Transliteration. That means you take the Greek letter and you put it into English. And so and it's always italicized. Okay, so that's important if you ever write a term paper, go on to seminary or something. Transliteration is always italicized. So the first letter, alpha, it's a ah sound, just like the letter A. You can see how similar these are. Beta looks just like a B, sounds like a B. Gamma, it looks like a G, and it is pronounced kind of like an NG sometimes if it's before these letters. Don't worry about that. A delta looks just like a D. Epsilon sounds like an E, an sound. Zeta, a funny looking Z. So these three are zeta, eta, theta. The Z, and this is a long A sound, and then a TH sound. Then the iota looks like an I without the dot on top. The kappa looks like a K, but it doesn't go up tall. It's just short. Lambda, it's a little different than the L, but it eventually evolved into an L. But it's an L sound. Ul. A mu kind of looks like an upside down M. A nu, that looks like a V, so don't get confused about that, but that's actually an N sound. N. This one's a little hard to pronounce. It's called a xi, xi, and it makes the sound of an X. Xi, xi. The Omicron is exactly the same in both languages. You might recognize the pi from math. Sometimes it's pronounced a P, but those who study math know it as pi. And so it's a P sound. This one's a little hard. Sometimes people get confused about these because it looks like a P in Greek, but it's actually a rho. Rho. It makes an R sound. Usually if it's at the beginning of a word, it has a rough breathing, so it's more of you put a breath behind it. Ruh, ruh, ruh. Like my wife's name, Rhonda. Rhonda. There's two forms of sigma. Looks like a circle with a little tail on it. That's in the middle of a word. And if it's at the end of a word, it kind of looks like a funny S, but these just make an S sound. A tau looks like a miniature T. Upsilon is a oo sound, oo, just like a U, but it's transliterated with a Y. So try not to get confused about that one. And then these next three combine sounds. So this is a phi, makes a PH, fa, or like an F, like phonogram, that comes directly from Greek. Phono means voice or sound. And then a he is kind of like a hard H, way back in your throat. And PS That's for psi, like we would say psychology, but we don't pronounce the P in English. But it comes from this word, psyche, psychology. And then the last one is called an omega, and it is a long O. Jesus is called the Alpha and Omega, beginning and the end in the book of Revelation. And then rough breathing is a little comma, and that you just put an H in front of a vowel. So don't worry about that. So that's Greek. It's fairly easy. There's just a few letters that are confusing, like a pi, and maybe the sigma is a little bit different. But you can learn Greek in probably about 15. You can learn the alphabet in about 15 minutes. It's not difficult at all. Now, Hebrew is a little more difficult. It has some similarities to Greek and English, but the letters they look different. So Aleph is the first. It's translated like a apostrophe, and it really doesn't make a sound, but it's kind of like an A. Bait is a B sound. Gimel, a G sound, just like over here in the Greek. So straight across, very similar. It just looks different. Looks like kind of like a man leaning back. Dalet, that's a D sound. So it's a little hard. See, these are all very square, and it's easy to get confused. A hey, that's a H sound. Hey, Vav makes a W or a V sound, depending what part of the world you come from. Zion is a Z sound. It's almost like a Vav, but a little bit different. Hate is like a hey, but it has a real strong, it's like you're clearing your throat. Hey, hey. It'd be very similar to a he down here. And it is a H with a dot underneath. Tate is a T sound, and it has a dot underneath. Yod is a Y sound. It's just a little tiny thing up towards the top, kind of like these, but these have a tail. But this is just a little tiny thing at the top. Yod is a Y sound. And then this is called a Kaf. It looks like a backwards C, and it makes a K sound. And this is what it looks like at the end of a word. It changes form. Lamed is an L sound, and it's a little difficult to see this one. Kind of looks like a number 7 with a little tail at the top. Mem is an M sound, and it kind of looks like a house with a chimney. And it has 2 different forms. One is at the end of a word. Noon, it almost looks like a Vav, but it has a little tail at the bottom. It's an N sound, and it changes form at the end of a word also. Samik it's kind of like a backwards sigma. It's an S sound. So a sigma has a little tail up at the top right. A samik has a little tail at the top left. Ayin really doesn't make a sound as such. It's called a guttural. It's kind of like a sound. It looks like a Y, and it looks like a transliterated with a apostrophe going the opposite way of a. So the alpha, it goes this way, it curves that way, and ayin curves the other way. A pei makes a P sound, and it also has 2 different forms. This is at the end of a word, and then in the middle. It looks just like a cop, but has a little tail in the middle of it. Tsade is a TS sound, a tsa, tsa, tsade. It is a S with a little dot underneath. And it kind of looks like a funny man who's leaning back and praying. And then it changes form at the end of a word. A kop is a Q, but it makes the same sound basically as a cop. So a cop and a cop. And so it looks just like a cop, but it has a little line on the side. Resh looks like a backwards R, and it makes an R sound. Now, these two are two different words that are very similar. The only difference is the little dot at the top called sin and shin. Sin is an S sound, and shin is an SH sound. So sometimes these get confused. And the last one is a tav. Now, if you want to learn these, you can go to Psalm 119 in your Bible. If you have a study Bible, I think I talked about this maybe last time. So turn to Psalm 119 if you have a Bible handy, English study Bible. And this psalm is written in the acrostic form. And every section has the Hebrew letters, the whole alphabet. So there's 22 sections because there's 22 Hebrew letters in the alphabet. So looking at Psalm 119, verses 1 through 8, the beginning of every one of those lines begin with an aleph. So let me just show you this real quick, and then we'll get back to, let's see, we'll get back to the other notes. But this is just some real quick explanation of things. If you're curious, let me bring up my Logos software again. And I will put in here Psalm 119. Okay. So if you see over here on the right side on your screen, this is Psalm 119 in BHS, which I've already explained to you. That's the Hebrew Bible. Notice verses 1 to 8. One other thing, Hebrew goes from right to left. It's backwards. So the first word is on the right. It goes from right to left. Greek is just like English, left to right, but Hebrew, right to left. So every first letter, notice it begins with a aleph. Aleph, 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 aleph. Then we come to verses 9 through 16. Everyone begins with a bait. Bait, 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 bait. That's called an acrostic. And it goes all the way through the Hebrew alphabet. All the way to the end. So if you want to learn the Hebrew alphabet, just go read Psalm 119 in a study Bible. Like, I don't know if you can see my screen very well, but this English Bible has sections listed there. A lot of study Bibles will have that. So that's the Hebrew alphabet. And so with a little practice, you can learn to pronounce these words. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Shan. Yeah. Yeah. Your Bible has it too. Yeah, I found that really interesting. And so with a little practice and learning what these vowel points are, probably about a week or so, and you'd be able to read this out loud. You might not know what it means, but you could pronounce it. So Ashereh, Timimei, Darek, Hahalkim, Betorat, Yahva. So that's God's sacred name right there, Yahweh. So you probably have heard of that word. And so with a little practice, you can learn what those are. Okay, let's go back then to our notes. Oh, while I have this up, let me show you the Greek New Testament. So I've been studying the book of Mark, and this is the beginning of the book of Mark. Now you might say, oh, some of those letters look like English. And yes, they do. Greek and English are fairly close together. So it would not take you very long to be able to pronounce these words. I don't know if you can see where my cursor is, but kai, egeneta, en, ekenais, tais, hemerais, eilthen, Iesus, apa, Nazareth, tes, Galileas, kai, ebaptiste. You might have heard, oh, it sounds like baptism. Yep, that's the word, baptism right there. Ebaptiste, eiston, Jordan, that's the Jordan River, and so on. So with a little practice, you'd be able to figure those out fairly quickly. All right, so it won't be quite as mysterious to you if you come across these things. And I'm going to show you how you can use this in a helpful Bible and internet site.
Pastor, can we download also those Logos Bible software of yours?
No, actually, you have to pay a lot of money for that.
Okay.
But there's some free ones. And let's see, I'll have to, I think like the Sword, I think is a free one. Some other ones, but I'll show you a free website that does not everything the Logos does, but it does quite a bit.
Because I think in sharing if you are going to, share to the Jehovah's Witness and Mormons, they are so particular of those original texts.
Oh, yeah. Well, that would take a little bit of study for you, but yeah, if you can, work with a little bit of that, maybe I'll just show you. Let me bring up the website and while we're on that topic. Okay, so a website that I use a lot is called Blue Letter Bible. Have you heard of that before? Blue Letter Bible. So this website is kind of like the Logos software, but not as powerful, but it's free.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's free. So let's look up John 3:16, and we can choose all kinds of English translations. I like to use the ESV because it's fairly literal. I'll talk about that in a minute. We'll talk about translations in a minute, but let's just look that up. All right, John 3:16. Now, if we go over here to tools, it says interlinear, Bibles, cross-references, commentaries, dictionaries, and miscellaneous. What we want to look at right now is called interlinear. An interlinear is where it puts the Greek into English over on the left. And then we also see the transliteration, which we just learned about.
Yeah, it's nice.
Yeah, so you don't even need to know Greek. What you need to do is learn Strong's number here. Okay. So you probably have this verse memorized. Don't worry about that up here. You can work on pronouncing that if you want. And one thing nice about this website, it will give you the pronunciation. So I need to share with my sound so you hear the sound. So now you can hear the sound. So you don't know what this word sounds like? Come over here, push the mic.
Strong's G 1063. Gar. Gar.
Well, I don't roll my
Oh.
R's like that. So this word, how do you pronounce this word?
Strong's G 2316. Theos. Theos.
So you can learn, we learned that that's called a theta, and it makes a TH sound. And the rest of this pretty easy, an E sound, an O sound, and an S. So theos. But you can see let me make this a little bigger on the screen. You can see right down here, this is called transliteration. It takes the Hebrew up here, or the Greek up here, and puts it into English letters.
Oh.
So let's say you want to learn. So this word loved.
Strong's G 25. Agapao. Agapao.
Okay, so we know how it sounds. Now let's say we want to look up what that word means. Just click on this. So what these words mean, this is Strong's. Strong was a man who lived, I don't know, probably 100 years ago. And he went through and numbered every different word in the Greek and Hebrew Bible. And so if you know the number, you can look up the word. You don't even need to know the Greek or Hebrew, as long as you know the number. So, which is so great with this website, you don't have to study the Greek and Hebrew. So let's look up the word loved. It is Greek number 25. Click on that. All right, agapao. That gives a pronunciation.
Strong's G 25. Agapao.
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 Okay, it's a verb. It's kind of related to this word, but let's not worry about that. So how is it translated? It's translated love 135 times in the New Testament and beloved 7 times. Outline of Bible usage. When it's used for persons, it means to welcome, to entertain, to be fond of, to love dearly. So these are all called semantic domains. All of these words in English are possible from that Greek word. Now, most of the time we translate it as love, but it possibly could have other meanings. And it seems like every Christian knows what agape love is. So that's what this is. This is the verb form of it. So if it's of things, it's to be well pleased, to be contented at or with a thing. Strong's definition, you kind of have to work your way through this, to love. So he only gives one. Thayer's Greek lexicon gives a little bit more. To love, to have preference for, wish well to, regard the welfare of. And then this is quite a long entry. Now, another nice thing about this website, it shows you every time this word occurs in the New Testament. So this is called a concordance. So every time this word is used in the New Testament, there's a long list, very popular. You can go on to the next and the next. So it occurs many times. Just look how many times in John's Gospel. This is the first time, but many times, especially chapter 13, 14, and 15, where Jesus talks about loving one another. And this is only the verb form. This is not the noun form. So we would have to look up the noun form as well. So this is all free. And you, with a little bit of work, you can begin to understand this. So you might look at other words like he gave. Now this, when you're talking to the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses, they might have some question about, was Jesus born? It
Yeah.
says he was God's only begotten right here, right? Well, this is a big theological word. Let's see how it sounds.
Strong's G 3439, monogenes. Monogenes.
So that's a big word. Theologians talk a lot about that. Only begotten. It's only used for Jesus. In this case. So you can look at how it's used at different spots. All right, so Blue Letter Bible, a very helpful website. So let's go back to
Thank you,
tools.
Pastor.
Yeah, tools. So look at Bibles. This gives us all these different translations, and we're going to talk about this in a minute. This has the same thing as Blue Letter Bible. I mean, Bible Gateway that I showed you a minute ago. Maybe not as many translations. Yeah, not as many. But it does give you some. Gives you cross references where this idea is found in other places. Commentaries, free ones. Wow, there's a lot here. All these are free. And then dictionaries. These are all free dictionaries. You have a whole library here. And then miscellaneous, I'm not sure what that is. Oh, pictures, maps. So yeah, this is a great resource.
Yeah, nice.
Okay. Well, so what do you think?
It's very nice. Very useful.
Yeah, with a little practice, you can, not everything on those websites is helpful. You just kind of have to kind of work your way through it.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about Bible translations. Why do we have so many? The first known translation of part of the Bible is described in Nehemiah chapter 8, verse 8. So let's see what Nehemiah chapter 8, verse 8 says. Nehemiah chapter 8, verse 8. They read from the book, from the law of God, translating to give the sense so that they understood the reading. So here's the problem. It was written in Hebrew, but now these people speak Aramaic. And so they didn't know what the Hebrew meant. So these scribes, and Nehemiah was one of them, would read the original and then translate it and explain it to people. So even in the Old Testament times, they were already translating. And then they continued to translate from Hebrew into Aramaic. And by the first century, the Jews had quite a collection. And this became known as the Targums. They tended to be a little more literal. And so if you want to know what those look like, you can actually look them up free on the internet. But don't worry about that. That's kind of advanced information. Not very many people get into that, but you can actually find the ancient Targums or translations into Aramaic in what's called the Aramaic Bible at this website. So the next big translation is called the Septuagint. Now this is a very important translation in Bible history. This is the first translation of the Bible from Hebrew into Greek. Now, as time went on and Alexander the Great and those who followed him conquered the Middle East and parts of Europe, all the way over to India, they brought with them their language. And so people began to speak Greek. And so Jews who spoke Greek could not read the Old Testament. there was a lot of them who lived in North Africa in the town called Alexandria, Egypt. And so these group of scholars, and the legend is that there were 70 of them, translated the Old Testament in 70 days from Hebrew into Greek. And so the word Septuagint means 70, and it is abbreviated with the Roman numbers LXX, which means 50 plus 10 plus 10, so that's 70. Sometimes you might see this abbreviated in writing. It just means the Septuagint. So the earliest Christians, like Paul and others who spoke Greek, this was their Bible. The early Christians, as the church spread out into the Greek-speaking world, they used the Septuagint as their Bible. So it's very important in the New Testament. A lot of quotations in the New Testament from the Old Testament come from the Septuagint, or maybe a paraphrase. Sometimes they just probably quote it from memory. Okay, there are other ancient versions that started to develop as the church and as Jews spread out. They translated the Old Testament and then later the New Testament into different languages. Some of those include Syriac in Syria. Eventually, the Bible was translated into Latin, and then other European languages. Latin became the major translation of the Western Church, located in Rome. And so the translation that Jerome made, and this is talked about here, is known as the Latin Vulgate. The Vulgate became the major Bible for the Roman Catholic Church, still important for Catholics. So it is the Bible translated into Latin. And so it's been used for 1800 years, and it's still used. And so part of those translations also included apocryphal books that were part of the Septuagint, but parts of the church did not accept the apocryphal books. Some parts did, some parts didn't. That's another discussion for us. So basically, as the church spread out, so did the translations. Now there's a problem, though, that developed in the Roman Catholic Church. The problem was that very few people in Europe spoke Latin anymore. And so it was only the priests, and most of them didn't know Latin. So what happened to the Bible is that it began to be neglected because no one could understand it. It was in a different language. So along the way came people like Martin Luther. One of the greatest things that Martin Luther did that brought about the Protestant Reformation was that he translated the Latin, and then he also learned Greek and Hebrew. So he translated the Bible into the local language of German. And so now people, for the first time, could read the Bible in their own language. And so it brought about a powerful revival in Europe. And then it was translated into English and into French and other European languages. And so over the centuries, as the church spread out in mission, the Bible has been translated into a majority of the languages of the world. Not every language yet, but most of the major languages have the Bible in their own language. And so that's the power. Now, today we have multiple translations. For example, in English, we have 100 different English translations. Why are they different? Why do we need a different translation? That's the question for the next part of our notes. As I said earlier, it is a challenge to go from the biblical languages to modern languages. Language constantly changes. Older translations become difficult for new generations to understand. So the King James Version of the Bible was translated around the year, I think it's 1611. Let me bring up the King James Version. You might be a little familiar with it. When I was a boy, we had the King James Version. So I learned John 3:16. John 3:16. I learned that in the King James Version. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Well, that one's not too hard. The only word there that's difficult is believeth. But sometimes the King James has the these and the thous. Well, that's not part of my vocabulary. I don't think about the these and the thous and the loveths and the all the other funny words sometimes, like the believeth here. Now that most of the King James is fairly easy to understand, and there's a lot of people today who still read the King James. But we have other translations. So why do we have other translations? Let's think about that for a moment. Translation methods and understanding of the biblical languages have improved over time. Scholars know more about the Hebrew and Greek than translators did 300 or 400 years ago. We know a lot more of what some of the words mean. We know about their range of meaning, their semantic domains. And also we have better manuscripts today than what they used, like, for example, in the King James era. Today we have thousands of manuscripts. Some of them are very early. And so we can get a lot closer to the original than what some of the earlier translators did. And so with language changing, we need to change and update our translations. And so you can read a lot of those on Bible Gateway. So there's two major philosophies of translation theory. The first one is called formal. This tends to be very literal. It gets as close as possible to the word order and structure of the original languages. And it tries to translate from word to word. Now, sometimes we cannot go word for word, because if we did that, the English would be, it would not make sense, because the word order in Hebrew and Greek is sometimes different. And so you might have the verb later on, or you might have the subject in the later on. In English, we have subject, verb, object, and so on. So you cannot always go word for word. But the formal translations tend to be more literal. I like to use these translations for my study. And so formal try to be very literal. Functional is more of taking an idea. You get the main idea of the passage. You may not use the exact words, but you take the main idea. It's more of a thought for thought, and it's not always literal, but it gets the main idea across. It puts the translation in an easier way and a more natural way for example, English speakers to speak. It sounds more like a conversation, the way, people think and speak. So that's called functional. So we have formal and functional. So here's a summary of them. A formal equivalent, literal, It focuses on the words and the grammar. It privileges the original language, it emphasizes. It's most attentive to the original context, what the author said. It retains ambiguities, which means that if it's not clear in the original, it tends to keep it that way. It tries to minimize interpretive bias. Remember, translations always involve interpretation. And so formal translations try to minimize that, keep it small. And they may try to replicate the author's style of writing when possible. The functional equivalent is also called dynamic. It focuses more on the meaning, trying to get the idea across. And it emphasizes more of the one who's reading than the author. It pays more attention to the context of the reader. It removes any ambiguities or things that are not clear in a translation. If it's a literal translation, sometimes it's just not clear. I mean, it's very difficult. So a functional translation will make it clear. It accepts the reality of interpretive bias, so it's much more interpretation involved with functional than with formal. And it may try to create a contemporary style of speaking. Now, there's a third style, it's more of a paraphrase. And we'll look at Bible Gateway and I'll show you some examples of that. A paraphrase just tries to get the main idea. It may not even have the same grammar as the original. It's just trying to put things into a way that people can get the idea. So this is a chart that shows where different English translations will fall. So actually, the King James and the Authorized Standard Version, I use quite often the NASB or the ESV. These are fairly literal. That's why I like to use them when I study, because they will get me closer to the Hebrew and Greek than will something over here. So my preferred Bible translations are NASB and ESV. I don't use the King James because I don't know what some of the words mean. The New King James is good too. And so the further right you go, the less literal it is. So a very popular Bible today is called the NIV. And it's more of in the middle. It does have some literal translations, but it's more of a thought for thought. And then if you keep going to the right, way over on the right is called the Message, and that's just a paraphrase. These ones over here are not word for word anymore. They're more of a thought for thought. They try to get the main idea across. So the NIV is popular because it puts things in easy English. The NASB and the ESV, they're a little more difficult to read. I would say these are probably like high school level English. The NIV is like middle school or even elementary English, so a lot easier to read. The Good News Bible, yeah, a child can understand that. So we're almost done with this. So translations are done usually with committees. So a committee is a group of people who get together and do the translations. Most of these translations listed here are not done by any one person. And so that means that whoever is on this committee sometimes brings their theological bias with them. And so, like, there's some translations that were done by dispensationalists, and they will have a dispensational leaning to them. There's a Catholic translation that leans towards Catholic interpretation. The NIV tends to be an evangelical translation, but even that, in the most recent version, has some biases, and I don't really like to use it anymore. And so it's helpful to be aware of what are the biases or the presuppositions or the views of the people who translated the Bible. Okay, let's go over the big ideas, and then we'll go look at a couple of translations just to illustrate this. Translations always involve interpretation about what words to use. You always have to choose. Sometimes it's very easy, like agape. Yeah, that's love. That's easy. But sometimes there are other words that can have multiple meanings, and we have to choose. The three languages of the Bible are Hebrew, Old Testament, Aramaic, only a few small parts, and Greek in the New Testament. Two important ancient translations of the Bible were the Septuagint, Greek, and the Vulgate, Latin. Those are very influential in the early church and throughout time. Two primary approaches to Bible translation are called the formal or literal and the functional, thought for thought. And then number 5, we should be aware of the theological biases of the translators of different Bible translations. Well, let's go back to Bible Gateway. And let's just put in, let's choose a different passage. Let's go to Romans 1. Oh, no, Romans 6. I'll go Romans 6. And I'm just going to choose verse 1. And I'm going to go to all English translations. Now let's choose a fairly literal one, the ASV. What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? That's fairly literal. Notice how they translate the word sin. In the original Greek, sin is actually a noun. Paul's talking about sin as a thing. Let's go to another literal, ESV. What shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin that grace may abound? Almost exactly the same. Now let's find one that's more in the middle, the NIV. What shall we say then? Shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? Now, this is the NIV has it wrong, I think. They turn sin here into a verb. Paul does not use the verb sinning here. And so the NIV, I believe, is a wrong translation of this verse. Well, let's go to a paraphrase, the Message. So, what do we do? Keep on sinning so that God can keep on forgiving? Well, the word forgiving doesn't occur in the Greek. And so the Message was actually translated by one person, but it's trying to get the idea across. So the Message doesn't even use verse numbers. And it says, I should hope not. The literal would be, well, we have to go to 6:2. So this says, God forbid. Well, the word God is not in there. So that's not accurate. By no means. That's more accurate to the Greek. So the Phillips is another translation. What is our response? Shall we sin in our hearts content so that we can exploit the grace of God? What a ghastly thought. So you can see how different these paraphrases are. So the ESV is very literal. It's close to the Greek. You could go look at the Greek and it's almost word for word. The NIV takes some liberties. It's in the middle. It gets the idea across. Yeah, that's okay. But the Phillips and the Message definitely paraphrases. So what do? Keep on sinning so that God can keep on forgiving? I sure hope not. Well, that's not in the Greek. It's actually a word that means may it not be, is the literal of that. So when you do your Bible study, you can compare. Sometimes you may not know, what a particular word means. And you can go look up some different English translations, and it gives you some very interesting ideas. We'll just do Romans 6. And we just start asking questions. How many questions can you create in one verse? Okay, so what shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin that grace may abound? Well, I start asking questions. What shall we say then? Well, why does Paul ask a question here?
Mm-hmm.
The word then means he's just said something. What did he just say? What is the context?
Okay.
So he's asking a rhetorical question. Where is he going with this? He's included the word we. So he's included the readers and himself. How does he want the readers to respond? So what I just do, about 10 questions on one little line. So are we to continue in sin? Well, what is sin? Why does Paul use the word continue here? Or at least this translation.
Mm-hmm.
What is grace? How does grace abound? What does abound mean?
Mm-hmm.
What is the relation of sin and grace? What do those mean in the context? Well, we know if we study chapter 5, he talks about sin and grace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes.
And so what is the problem that stands behind these questions? Why does Paul put this in rhetorical questions? So, you just start asking all these questions, and soon if you write them down, you have, I don't know, how many did I just ask? Probably 20 questions on one verse. And so those will get you into the study, so you want to answer those questions.
Yes.
Now, sometimes you might have people. So who is Peter?
Mm-hmm.
Who is Paul? Why did he write this letter? Who are the Romans? And so you start asking all these questions. Sometimes you don't know what the answers are. For example, you tell me, is this a good question? What kind of fish swallowed Jonah? Is that a good question? What do you think?
For me, it's yes.
You think that's an important question? Okay, can you answer that?
Yeah, I think for me it's yes, because how did Jonah fit on that fish, and then how come he didn't melt or swallowed?
Okay.
I mean, melt in the stomach.
You're starting to ask
Something
other
like
questions
you
though. Can you tell me what kind of fish it was?
Then I can connect them to the power of the Lord, to the mighty act of the Lord, that for God nothing is impossible. So for me, I can connect that question to the power and the working of the Lord, that the Lord can do anything. For man, it's impossible, but for God, it's possible.
Okay, you haven't answered the question though. What kind of fish swallowed Jonah? Can you tell me?
In Filipino, it's butanding. In Philippines, we call it butanding.
Okay. Does it say
We
that
actually have the answers.
Does it say that in Jonah?
Oh, it's did
I don't
it
think we can.
just say big fish?
Okay. Let's see. Let's see. Let's look for it. he sees. Okay, all we have is a great fish. We don't know what kind of fish it was, though, do we? Was it a whale? Was it a shark? Was it an oversized tuna? So sometimes we ask questions we can't answer. The only thing we know is the size of the fish, or that it was big enough for him to
Yes.
swallow him, right?
Yeah.
But we don't know if it
Yes.
was a whale. Now, tell me, is this an important question?
Okay.
Why did a fish swallow Jonah? Is that important? Why did a fish swallow Jonah?
Yes, that's important.
Yes, that is an important question. And can we answer that?
Yeah.
Yes, we can. So sometimes we
Yes.
ask questions that, well, we might be curious about, but we can't really answer it based on the passage. Now,
Mhm.
now what kind of fish? Now we can say a great fish. But beyond that, we don't know what kind of what do you call it in science? We don't know what species it was. But so sometimes we ask questions we can't really answer. If we do, put it aside. It's not that important. So with skill, you begin to answer or ask important questions. Now, why did a fish swallow Jonah? That's one of the most important questions in this chapter. It's one of the most important questions in the entire book of Jonah. The why question.
Mm. Mm.
Now, those why questions tend to be the most important questions that we can ask. The why question.
Yes.
But we can ask who, what, when, where,
How?
how, and why.
Mhm.
Now, asking those other questions can be helpful, like when did the fish swallow Jonah? Well, we don't know the exact time, but we know it was after he fled.
Mm.
So that's helpful. Where we don't know for sure, but it was out in the ocean on his way to Tarshish. So sometimes we may not know the exact location in the Mediterranean Ocean, but we can ask those questions, like what kind of fish? We don't know the species, but we know it was a great fish. So as Maribel was saying, so that helps us then go to other ideas. So
Yes.
I'm just pushing a little bit because there's no wrong question. Sometimes, well, I guess there can be wrong questions, but sometimes there's better questions. So maybe the why questions leads Maribel to her conclusions a little quicker, because it sounded to me like she was starting to answer the why question.
Okay. I see.
All right.
Mhm.
Okay. So it just takes a little practice, and you start asking these questions, you write them down. You might say, well, that one's not that important. I'll just put it aside. You might ask a question you don't know the answer for.
Yeah, because Father, in children's ministry,
Oh, they want to know what kind of fish it is.
Yeah, just
It
say it was a
was.
big fish. Great fish.
when you teach children, there's not important questions, but you are for.
Yeah, but you have to be careful that you don't use your imagination too much so that you change the meaning.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you,
Yeah,
Pastor.
sometimes preachers are really good at that. So you have to kind of choose, and now you can use your imagination. Sure, if you're teaching children, you can use your imagination so they can think of it. And so this is kind of like a silly one. But sometimes, we might start to bend the meaning of some passages, that's not their intention. And so that comes with skill and practice and study. You over time, you realize that, certain ideas are more important. So what are important ideas? I always look at God, humanity, any person of the Trinity, God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, humanity, and that has to do with sin, salvation, God's grace, mercy. I don't pay too much attention to, what controversial things in the Bible where no one really knows what the answer might be. I'm curious about that, but I can't answer it. But I rather focus on things that affect me spiritually and help me grow and help me understand God better, help me understand myself, my place in the world. And I think those are the things we tend to move towards and gravitate towards in our applications. I'm not going to preach a sermon on the big fish, that might be, an illustration, but the big point is that Jonah was running from God, and and God had to get hold of him. Now you can preach on that, right? That's a good revival message. So the Bible has many details, and they give us good pictures of things. But there are things that help us focus in on the main messages. Okay. What do you think? Any more questions or observations?
I feel like I'm learning on how to ask questions, because I'm leading a Bible study every week. So I have to give many questions, and before I start to lead the Bible study, and trying to find out every answer for every questions.
Yeah,
so
that's a great point to bring up. So many of the questions you ask in your study become good questions to ask people. And I like to ask questions in a Bible study that they can answer, or maybe that, helps them think a little bit.
Yes.
So we've studied, the story of Jonah. We've looked at the details. And then towards the end, you might ask, well, why did Jonah run from God? What does that tell us about Jonah, and what does it tell us about God? Oh boy, those are great discussion questions. You could spend an hour on those, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there's so many things you could do in this particular chapter. You could look at the sailors. It's interesting that they believe in God, but it looks like Jonah doesn't. It says they call out to the Lord,